Well, let's go ahead and get started. This is one of our more ambitious projects. I don't know if everybody realizes, but we have 6 presenters from literally around the world this time. We have about 45 minutes to an hour for each presenter, and we'll be starting off from Zurich, Switzerland with Murray Stein. We'll then go to Northern England with Margaret Wilkinson. And then we'll go to Sonoma, California, where Bob Haas has 4 presenters lined up that he'll be presenting to you as well. The lay of the land will be 2 hours initially, and the first 2 hours will be our European cohort. So that'll be Zurich and England. Then we'll take a 1-hour break, which might be lunch or dinner or late breakfast if you're in California. And we'll come back after that break and have 3 more hours of California presenters, and that will be the 4 presenters out there. They'll have a little bit less than an hour per presenter. So, welcome. Just to introduce myself, my name is Steve Buser. I am a psychiatrist here in the Asheville, North Carolina area. Myself and Lynn Cruz co-founded the Asheville Young Center about 4 years ago, and I'm a psychiatrist in private practice. I've done a 2-year clinical training program up at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago, and that got me started with all this, and that's where I met Murray Stein, and we began this many years ago. We have about 140 people joining us today from around the world, and we have 19 countries. And our custom is to read the countries that are joining us, and they include Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Israel, Mexico, the Netherlands, Russia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Ukraine, United Kingdom, and of course United States. And again, we want to thank such a broad worldwide audience. This is really the dream of what we've been doing here, is to integrate the Jungian community worldwide and to learn from some of the best teachers around the world. And I think you're going to really experience that today in a very special way. So thank you, everybody. Do visit our website when you get the chance, AshevilleYoungCenter.org. That's our organization. And we have a number of things going on there. We have live seminars like today's. We have recorded seminars, both in web streaming and DVD format. We have written transcripts available for many of our seminars. We have a regular blog, social media, Twitter, Facebook, a number of things to check out. I do realize we have continuing education credits for many professionals, and go to our website and you can look up the specific details of that. We have a few exciting programs I want to tell you briefly about coming up. Our next one on the docket is Wednesday, July 18th, and it will be Stalking the Predator. And this will be by our resident film critic, Dan Ross. He's out of the Chicago area. He is going through already the clinical training program in Chicago and about to start the analytical training program there. Wonderful presenter, really knows films and archetype. And this will be looking at the archetype of the predator in film. And we'll be looking at a couple of specific films that I think you'll really enjoy with that. Do watch the films beforehand. They're listed on the website, and then join the seminar. We also hope to have Mike DeMeritt join us again. He's a film director out in Los Angeles. His schedule is quite busy being out there, but hopefully he'll be able to join and participate in that as well. We've got my personal favorite is our End of the World seminar, which we're planning for November of this year. You'll note that's November and not December, because if the world really does end in December, we thought you'd miss the seminar, and that would be a shame. So you'll have one chance to see the seminar before the world's end. And Murray Stein will be leading that one. A quick thanks to a number of folks. UNCA, which is the University of North Carolina, Asheville. That's where our room here is seated at. And we want to thank the Department of Psychology, the Distance Learning Center, and the NC Rent System, which is the hub of this technology. We would like to thank the ETH University, which is also known as the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. That's the same university Carl Jung taught at himself. He was a professor there, and that's where Murray Stein is seated and will be lecturing from. We want to thank ISAP Zurich, International School of Analytical Psychology, Zurich. That's where Murray Stein is the past president and a very active analyst there. They've loaned us many of their leading analysts, and we really want to thank them for the continued support of this. Next, the Northern School of Child and Adolescent Psychotherapy, also known as the Tabby of the North, I'm told, for the Tavistock Clinic. They are in Northern England, in Leeds, and that's where Margaret Wilkinson will be presenting from. And we really want to thank them for allowing us to plug into their network system today. Sonoma State University in Sonoma, California. Laura McCabe and Bob Haas and others will be out there. We want to thank their Department of Psychology and their Distance Learning Center as well. The IASD, the International Association for the Study of Dreams, we would like to thank. They just completed their conference in Berkeley, California a few days ago. I'm sure Bob Haas will be telling us a little bit about that conference, how that went. And they've loaned us 4 of their presenters who have stayed graciously a couple days past the conference, and they will be presenting our afternoon series. We want to thank them as well. And I believe the Omaha Friends of Young are joining us as well. They may not be a fully interactive site, but they're participating also. So you can tell this is a big program. We have a lot of partners, a lot of presenters, and we really appreciate all their input. A few quick things before we do the morning introductions. One is I am required to announce that we have no commercial support for our presenters, topics, or programs. There is no pharmaceutical industry support of any kind associated with us today. We will be sending out a survey later. That's important for continuing education credits, as well as an examination if you're pursuing credits, and look for that out as well. The examination may be delayed a day or two, but you'll also have the archived version and a transcript available. We're going to try to get the exam out as soon as possible for folks. Do realize that we make DVDs of most of these recordings as well as web streaming archives, so that if you ask a direct question from an active site, your voice and image may be recorded. If you'd rather not have that happen, just write out the question, hand it to any of the moderators, and we will ask the question. For our home viewers, and there are quite a bit of you today, 130 to 140, a few quick announcements. If you have any difficulties, please email us, info@ashevilleyoungcenter.org. I'm sure you've seen that email a number of times. And a couple of things to remember. There are 3 volume controls to work with. There's a volume control on the web streamer itself. There's a icon most often on your desktop that controls volume, and you might have a volume knob to turn as well. So if the volume is too low, make sure you've optimized all 3 volumes. We usually get a slew of questions about that in the first few minutes, but turn up all 3 volumes. A few buttons to play with. One is swap media. That will change the PowerPoint, when there are PowerPoints, to the video stream. You can click on enter full screen, which will make the screen bigger, but you can't ask questions in that. You have to exit full screen to hit the little dialog balloon to send me a question. So when you do have questions for the presenters, please exit full screen, click on the dialog balloon, and then you can type in your question. I'll get those here, and I'll answer, or I'll ask as many as possible to the presenters. Do realize we have a lot of people in the live sites as well as at the home audience, so we may not get to all the questions, but do send those as soon as you have any questions. Turn off any cell phones if you're at a live interactive site. And remember, we'll have 2 breaks. We'll have an hour break. After the 2-hour mark, we'll have a lunch break for an hour. And then for the 3-hour afternoon session, we'll probably break somewhere in between. We'll let Bob Haas decide the exact timing of that. And we'll give people a 10 or 15-minute stretch break in the middle of the longer one. So I'm going to introduce the morning, I shouldn't say morning, but the first half speakers. And then Bob Haas and Laura McCabe will introduce the second half speakers. For our first hour, we'll have Murray Stein. Second hour, Margaret Wilkinson. Let me tell you briefly about the 2 of them. Murray, most of you know. Virtually everybody has seen him. He's our main anchor presenter and has done a marvelous job in so many presentations with us. But briefly, Murray, I used to say is the president, but now he's the past president of ISAP, International School of Analytical Psychology. He's also been the president of the International Association of Analytical Psychology. He's a gifted teacher, is really excellent at bringing complex material to a broad audience, and a very profound author. If you Google him or look at Amazon, you'll see dozens of books and many, many articles that he's published. And I recommend really anything he's written. Margaret Wilkinson is our second Jungian analyst to present today. She is in Northern England, presenting out of the Leeds area. She is a Jungian analyst with a special interest in neurobiology and dreaming, which fits in very well with our topic today. She is on the editorial board for the Journal of Analytical Psychology, one of our main journals in Jungian circles. She's the author of two books that overlap with what we're talking about today. One is Coming into Mind, the Mind-Brain Relationship, a Jungian Clinical Perspective. That was 2006. And then Changing Minds in Therapy, Emotion, Attachment, Trauma, and Neurobiology. That's a 2010 book. And she is in private practice in northern Derbyshire, if I said that right, England. So without further ado, we turn over to Dr. Murray Stein in Zurich, Switzerland. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, coming across loud and clear.
I'm going to talk about the theme of tending or attending to what I call the lunar mind in Jungian psychoanalysis. And I'll start with a definition of what I mean by the lunar mind, and then give you some examples of how Jungian analysts work with this aspect of our human psyche. One of the more frustrating things about a lot of Jungians is that when you ask them for a decision and you give them a very careful explanation of what you're asking, you don't get an answer immediately. They will say, well, I've got to sleep on it and see if I have a dream. It can be very irritating and time-consuming, but it's deeply ingrained in us through our training and studies that there is a part of the mind that's not fully accessible to our waking life that we need to wait on or attend to. And quite a bit of analysis is dedicated to looking at, listening to, trying to invite into consciousness what this part of the mind wants to tell us. So I call it the lunar mind. I wrote a book some years ago called Solar Conscience, Lunar Conscience, and talked about two types of ways of making ethical decisions, one a more conscious and superego-oriented type, and one a more tuned into what I'm calling the lunar mind here. So let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by the lunar mind. These last 30, 40, 50 years, there's been a lot of interest in neuroscience, and Margaret Wilkinson will tell you a great deal about that. I'm not an expert on it. I will go light on neuroscience in my talk, but I will introduce it to support some of the conclusions that one can draw about the lunar mind. Of course, Jung had no idea of what neuroscience would produce in the way of its research and insights into the workings of the brain. But he did have a clear intuition that there are two contrasting ways of thinking or processing information. And he began formulating this difference very early in 1912 in his book, The Psychology of the Unconscious, English translation, where he talks about two types of thinking. What he calls directed thinking, and on the one side, rational, conscious thinking, logical, and the other, fantasy thinking. Fantasy thinking is more associative, less organized or structured by logic, perhaps more emotional, more pictorial, thinking in stories and pictures. that type of thinking. And he lifted this distinction into his work while he was studying the Lunar productions, if you will, the fantasy productions of a young woman named Miss Miller. And he studied her fantasies very carefully and tried to interpret them. And these two types of thinking that he at first considered as arranged in a preferred and a lesser fashion. In other words, he valued them or evaluated them, that the directed thinking was more developed, grown-up thinking, more sophisticated, more valuable, more productive, whereas fantasy thinking was more childish and less oriented toward reality, of course, and perhaps narcissistic or self-referential and therefore not terribly valued. That was his first take on these two types of thinking, but he changed his mind quite quickly when he himself engaged in what he called fantasy thinking or fantasying, and that came about shortly after he came upon this distinction, 1913, following when the so-called Red Book period took place, and he engaged very actively in fantasy thinking, and to his great surprise discovered that it has quite a lot to offer. Some very interesting material and contents came forward through engaging in this type of thinking, and it really changed his mind about the value of fantasy thinking, that it can reach into and touch areas of the psyche that directed thinking doesn't know anything about or doesn't have access to or finds very difficult to understand, interpret, tends to disregard, tends to put down and dismiss. And so it's a tremendous re-evaluation of this other part of the mind as he went forward in his own life experience and delved into and used this other type of thinking, fantasy thinking. Now, when he talked about this in the Red Book, he made another distinction that goes along with this, and he talked about the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. And the spirit of the times is directed thinking, it's solar thinking, it's what we all know, what we all learn in school, it's what we're trained in. Our brains and our minds are trained to do this type of thinking. The other type of thinking is of the night. Spirit of the depths doesn't belong to the spirit of the times. It's a very different path. And these two paths diverged. And for a period of time, he chose to take the path of the spirit of the depths, at least to a certain extent. He didn't go totally into the depths and neglect the spirit of the times. He kept a balance. During the day, he worked, and at night, he did his active imaginations and his inner work and followed the spirit of the depths. But through this experience, again, he was able to discover that these two sides of the mind, in a sense, belong together, but they operate very differently. And later, when neuroscience came along and discovered left brain and right brain functioning as being quite different, left brain functioning being more logical and verbal and directed, and right brain functioning being more associative and artistic and image-oriented, more or less fell into the same categories that Jung had intuited. Well, and Jung worked with those then in his analytic work and in his teaching, and he encouraged his students to delve into this other type of thinking, to use it, to look at their dreams coming from another side of the mind. They're not directed, they're not organized by our conscious egos, so on. We're presented with something very strange and bizarre often. That comes from the other part of the mind. And also their imagination, their fantasies, to invent narratives, to engage in active imagination is to engage in this other type of thinking. So I'm going to put those items together and just give you a definition of what I mean by the lunar mind. I'm speaking about the sleeping mind at work as it dreams, or the dreaming brain, as it's sometimes called. And here I'll give you a little bit of neuroscience. Margaret will fill you in on that probably as much as you want. If you ask her questions, she's got a lot to offer, read her books. And also combine that sleeping mind, dreaming brain, with the probably mostly right brain activity we know as active imagination, or thinking in images and stories. The lunar mind, as I'm going to speak about it, is a combination of these two. So the dreaming brain and the fantasying, waking mind. Now, the dreaming mind, as well as the waking, imagining mind, or the lunar mind, are more emotional and imagistic than the analytic and reflective mind, the solar mind. Okay, let's make that distinction. The analytic and reflective mind is the solar mind, and the lunar mind is the imaging mind, emotional and imagistic. And the lunar mind creates scenes and stories. And these scenes and stories are based on associations, sometimes memories, bits of memory associated to one another, as well as what we recognize in Jungian psychology as archetypal motifs. So that if you're doing active imagination or you look carefully at dreams, you'll often see patterns or motifs that you can identify as being universals. They don't just belong to you individually or personally. They're characteristic of many people, many cultures, all times and places. So these motifs are also woven into the productions of the lunar mind. Now, the lunar mind is weak on analytic thinking. And a kind of analytic reflection. As we know these functions in our conscious waking life. And in dreaming, also memory is a bit different. Declarative memory, that is memory that is attained quickly and consciously, is attenuated or more or less absent. But this lunar mind, or the dreaming mind, is a mind at work, and it's busy with many important activities that benefit our well-being and indeed ensure our survival. I'm going to give you a quotation from a lunar scientist, a scientist of the dreaming brain called J. Allen Hobson. He's very well known in that field. And he's a neuroscientist who studied the dreaming brain for many years. And here I will quote one of his conclusions in the book, Dreaming: An Introduction to the Science of Sleep. Incidentally, the scientific study of dreams and dreaming was begun in the 1950s in a systematic laboratory sort of way, I think at the University of Chicago at first, in dream laboratories. And one of the first findings was that it seemed like there was a correlation between REM sleep and dreaming, so that when people's eyelids flickered while they were sleeping and they were waked up, they would report dreaming. And so for quite a long period of time, there was a close association between REM sleep, which is a certain level of sleep that you achieve during the sleep cycle, and dreaming. And later studies have shown that dreaming isn't restricted to REM sleep. It takes place during other parts of the sleep cycle as well. So that was in later studies unhooked. REM sleep and the dreaming brain are not exactly synchronized or identical. But this dreaming brain has been very carefully studied by Hobson and other people. And they've looked at it from many angles. They're not terribly interested in the content of the dreams that are produced while they're studying the brain. They're more interested in what the brain is doing while the person is dreaming, and what's going on chemically in the brain, and what parts of the brain are activated, what parts of the brain are turned off. And the dreaming brain is quite different from the waking brain. So in a sense, we've got two computers running in us. There's a waking computer and a sleeping computer. When you're sleeping, the dreaming brain is operating. When you're awake, the waking brain is operating. It might be that while you're awake, the dreaming brain is sort of quietly operating in the background as well, and that you can dip into it every now and then by allowing fantasies to emerge. It's possible that we could be more in touch with what's going on in the lunar mind than we normally are. But here's its conclusion about dreams after many years of studying the subject from a neuroscience point of view. He says our dreams are emotional. That's one of his main conclusions, that and people who pay attention to their dreams, and most of us Jungians do a great deal, we realize that our dreams largely are very, very packed with emotion. They're very colored by strong affects. So our dreams are emotional and something that psychologists term hyper-associative. In other words, the thoughts that are brought together in dreams are brought together by leaps of association, like a hyper string. And these associations are exceptional in that your waking brain probably, while it also operates by associations, wouldn't make these hyperlinks. So the sleeping brain, dreaming brain is hyper-associative and emotional. And he says it's because our brains are activated, during sleep our brains are activated by cholinergic rather than aminergic chemicals. So the brain is bathed in a different chemical bath while sleeping than while it's awake. Thus we restore the most fundamental aspects of our cognitive ability. And Hobson has studied this quite carefully, that dreaming is very important for good cognitive functioning, and actually restores our cognitive capability, he says. That is, the capacity to order our memories in a way that serves survival. Emotional salience, so emotional strength and energy, emotional salience or relevance is a general mnemonic rule. Our level of emotional competence, again, so emotional intelligence might be related to the lunar mind, whereas the solar mind is a more thinking, rational, calculating, practical kind of mind. But our level of emotional competence, he says, has a high survival value and underlies the more precise information needed to function socially. It's a very important statement. Our emotional competence. In other words, we need first and foremost to know when to approach. So this is saying that the lunar mind is also intuitive. How do you know when to approach somebody, when not to approach them? You probably make that decision very quickly when you look at them. Your unconscious is operating while you aren't aware of it, and you take a reading on somebody very quickly. Should you approach them? Should you not? Or when to mate, when to be afraid, and when to run for cover. It has a real survival value to know when to run for cover if you're threatened. These are the skills that sleep refreshes every night of our lives by activating our brains. The brain is active while you're sleeping and dreaming, with no regard for the details of declarative memory, that is, memory that is learned quickly and consciously. That is offline during sleeping and dreaming. As with thermoregulation, and that's another function of mammals, that they have to regulate their body temperature. That seems to be related to sleep, also connected to dreaming. As with thermoregulation and immunity to infection, our instincts to flee, fight, feel, and fornicate are crucial to survival and to procreation. So you see what a great value very different from a Jungian value, but nevertheless, Hobson places upon the dreaming mind this instinct, renewal of instinct and refreshing of instinct, sharpening of instinct that takes place as a result of the brain's activity during sleep while it's dreaming. So in Jungian language, if we take Hobson's statement and do a translation into Jungian, we could say that the dreaming mind is closer to archetype and instinct than is the waking mind. We're more in touch with the archetypal and instinctual level of ourselves while we're dreaming. It's more emotional, it's hyper-associative, it brings in archetypal motifs and so on. And this is basically the same thing that Jung called the primitive mind. And Jung was very, very keen on having people connect to the primitive in themselves because he thought that had great survival value and was very much endangered by modernity, by people living in very artificial environments, in cities. We override all of our instinctual knowledge or instinctual intuitions because the lights are on all the time, the television is going all the time. We don't really have time or capacities to consult our deeper instinctual life unless we turn all that stuff off and go back into nature for a while or go to sleep. Go to sleep and start dreaming, and you're closer to your instinctual base and to the archetypal core of yourself than you are while you're busy with modernity. Okay, so that's the value of the lunar mind, and its a high value is placed in Jungian therapy and psychoanalysis on bringing that part of the mind closer to our waking life, to bringing us closer into contact with our deeper instinctual base and our archetypal core. Now, it's also the case that the lunar mind is autonomous. That is, it's free of the ego's control. In our waking mind, in our daytime mind, as we go about our business, we feel at least, and maybe it's largely an illusion, but that we're in control of our minds. However, in the lunar mind, or in the sleeping, dreaming mind, the ego is not in control of the story. It's not creating the story. It's a subject in the story. It's one of the characters in the story. It might be a center of consciousness, but it's not creating the story. In other words, the lunar mind has taken over, and the ego is not in charge of that mind. It's not the controlling center. So its consciousness is of a different sort. In the solar form, solar mind, consciousness is under the control, more or less, of its center, the individual ego. Centered, it's focused, it includes analytic functions, declarative memory. It's what we're familiar with in our daytime experience. It's practical, can make decisions, can remember from one moment to the next and one day to the next who it is, where it is, what needs to be done, and so on. And it proceeds by directed thinking rather than by these hyper-associations, metaphors, and images. So in the solar world, the ego makes plans and executes them. It has control over the body, the motoric system. In the lunar world, it's subject to other psychic forces and does not appear to be able to control them. That's quite a difference. Now in alchemy, which Jung studied later in his life with great interest, solar and lunar images are brought together as brother and sister pair. Sol, the sun, and Luna, the moon, are related as a brother is to a sister. And in analysis, we attempt to bring these two minds together also in such a complementary way to create a single unit or entity or body the mind as a whole, so that these two complementary aspects can speak to each other and consult with each other and create a relationship. And the field of analysis that we create in our offices, in our practices, is partially under the control of the solar mind, but only partially, because once one enters into the analytic field, the lunar mind is invited and comes into play, and the analyst gives over control, lets go of the solar mind and the ego, and allows fantasy to start entering, images to start entering, hyper-associations to start entering, starts making connections that might seem very odd to a normal waking mind, based on associations that are widely scattered in the session. And so the lunar mind has a great role to play in the analytic process itself. The analytic process is not under the control of the solar mind alone. Solar mind is there. It's a practical mind. It charges fees. It sets times. There are rules and regulations that are followed. There's memory. There's analysis. But the lunar mind comes powerfully into play in analysis. If it doesn't, you don't get a deep analytic process. Without the lunar mind, you don't make deep soulful connections, because that's the lunar mind opens to the mutuality of an unconscious process that emerges within the analytic container. Now, when this lunar mind is turned on or invited into analysis, it's also very powerfully contagious. And most experienced analysts can tell you lots of stories about how they've picked up an emotional field, how they've been infected and affected by a powerful dream that their patient brought them, so that a field of mutuality, emotional mutuality, is created through the account, the telling, the retelling of a dream. When you bring a dream into the analytic session, you are bringing the lunar mind, a production of the lunar mind, into the presence of the solar minds who are sitting in the session. And I'll give you an example of this, and of this contagion that happened to me quite some years ago in a session that I had with a young man who I had seen for a rather short period of time. He came to me, I think he was in his mid-30s, with a slight depression and some problems he wanted to discuss, and we had maybe 5 or 6 sessions before he brought this dream. And it was a very powerful dream. He dreamed that he was in a famous church, the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. And this is an ancient church built by Christians and then taken over by the Muslims when they conquered Constantinople, and they turned it into a Islamic place of worship. But it still has this combination of Christian and Islamic features to it. And he had visited this place actually in his several years earlier on a trip to Istanbul. But in the dream, he walks into this cathedral, and he passes under the dome, which you can see in the picture. And in the dome itself, there is a painting of the Holy Trinity, surrounded by angels. It's a heavenly court, and God the Father, and God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and beautiful depiction of the heavenly realm. And he looked up there in the dream, up into the dome, and then he felt himself levitating slowly, coming off the ground, going up. And as he's telling me this dream, I'm starting to picture this place, and I'm starting to feel this kind of lightness in the atmosphere, and I'm sort of rising up with him as he tells me this. We're going up. And then he says, as he gets up off the ground a ways, the figures in the dome become activated, and they start moving around, and suddenly God the Father steps forward and comes down toward him, and as he's coming up and God the Father is coming down, God the Father points at him and says, I want you. And with that, we both practically burst into tears. It was so emotional, this moment of being chosen by God the Father. And it was especially powerful because this man was an orphan and had been adopted when he was 4 years old. And he remembered those years in the orphanage before he was chosen. And the routine was that the children would be lined up and couples would come in and look at them to decide if they would like to take one or another home for the weekend to see, if they could make a connection, they would like to adopt this one. And he had watched other children being chosen, and one day a couple came in, and they selected him, and they took him home, and they adopted him, and he grew up with them. And he never quite felt that he belonged there, of course. Difficult situation. They were very good to him, but they were older and a little bit stiff and cold, and gave him everything that money could buy. He grew up in very privileged surroundings. But he always felt that deeply inside himself, he was still an orphan. Somewhere he had not really been fully accepted by the father or by a parental figure. And in this dream, that seemed to be overcome, and that's why it was so emotional, and it infected both of us. So we were both in this lunar world, very powerfully constellated, extremely emotional, hyper-associative, full of connections to my religious background, his childhood. It was electrifying. Now, these kinds of moments that Jung would call numinous experiences happen within this lunar realm that gets constellated in the analytic vessel from time to time, and it's very transformative and touches one's deepest emotions. And I think this does have a transformative effect also on the brain, as Margaret will tell you about in the next segment, that these kinds of reparative emotional experiences that come from dreams sometimes from elsewhere, but often from dreams, shared in the analytic vessel and in the transference-countertransference relationship in that field, have a very powerful transformative effect on the psyche. Now, the question is, who makes dreams, or what in us makes up the dream? As I read several books about neuroscientific research on the dreaming brain, as far as I could tell, nobody has discovered the dream maker. Who is responsible? Which group of cells in the brain are responsible for putting together these hyper-associated bits? And Hobson, for instance, doesn't spend too much time trying to interpret the contents of the brain, and many of the dream, and many of the researchers have spent little time on interpretation of contents. Some have. But to my knowledge, nobody has discovered the source of the creative process that puts together the elements of the dream. And so I would like to leave that a mystery and say that there is a dream maker. And Jung had lots to say about this, who the dream maker is, although he also left it a mystery himself. But in a passage of the Red Book, there's a very interesting moment where Jung writes about a dream that he had the night before. And I just want to pick out a couple of words from this to emphasize this point that the dream maker is autonomous and different from the ego or any part of the brain that we so far have been able to identify. He says, I wake up, the day reddens in the east, a night, a wonderful night in the darkest depths of time lies behind me. And then this sentence, in what faraway rooms was I? He asks himself. And then in German he says, was träumte mir? In English that's mistranslated as, what did I dream? Actually, it should be, what dreamt me? Was träumte mir? Not, was habe ich geträumt? With putting the ego in the place of, the I central to the whole thing. Was träumte mir? What dreamt me? And then of a white horse. It is me, as though I had seen this white horse in the eastern sky above the rising sun. So this question that he asks, was träumte mir, I think he puts his finger on this question of the dream maker. That is, the organizer of the stories and the images and the associations. What selects the elements? And what is its intention? Now, we call this the dream maker. Think of it as the self. In another passage that I don't have for you to read, but I can tell you about it, Jung was asked by someone if he looks at dreams, reads dreams for their content because they expose the complexes, a person's complexes, subpersonalities. And he said, yes, the dreams do. The figures in the dreams are representations or characters dressed up as the complexes, representing the complexes. There's a father, a mother, a hero, and so on. So, but I don't need the dream to tell a person about their complexes. I can sit down with them for half an hour and pick up most of their complexes from the conversation. What I'm really interested in the dream, why I'm interested in the dream, is what is the dream doing with the complexes? There is something behind the dream arranging the complexes and giving them a spin, and that's what we're interested in when we look at the dream. What is the dream's intention? Putting a particular story together, what's the meaning of that? So we spend a lot of time in analysis reflecting on this question of what does the dream mean? And we never are sure that we've got it completely, that we know what a dream means. But here's a passage from another one of Jung's writings that I found very interesting, where he discusses the importance of simply reflecting on dreams, talking about them within the analytic container. He says, to concern ourselves with dreams is a way of reflecting on ourselves, a way of self-reflection. It's not our ego consciousness reflecting on itself, that is, the solar mind looking at itself, ruminating about itself, trying to introspect. It's not our self-consciousness reflecting on itself. Rather, it turns its attention to the objective actuality of the dream as a communication or message from the unconscious. Unitary soul of humanity. Quite an expression. What we're really reflecting on is a communication from the unconscious, which is the unitary soul of humanity. So it reflects not on the ego, but on the self. It recollects the strange self, alien to the ego, which was ours from the beginning, the trunk from which the ego grew. It is alien to us, because through the aberrations of consciousness, we have alienated ourselves from it. So by turning the solar mind to the lunar mind, it's looking to the depths, looking into the archetypal base, looking into the source of the emotional source of where we come from, the matrix, the mother, and lifting that up toward consciousness and joining Saul to, that is, the individual ego, to the unitary soul of humanity. That's a long, long stretch. So it's not just about connecting one to one's own childhood, one's own individuality, one's own personal history. All of that is also true, and you get a lot of that through associations in dreams. But ultimately also connecting us to something far deeper that he calls here the unitary soul of humanity. And that's where this process can ultimately lead. The reflection on dreams and the lunar mind leads us ever deeper into our common humanity and structure and the soul of the general population as a whole, all of humanity, and even beyond humanity to all of nature and the cosmos. Now, we know that the solar mind plans and strategizes and looks ahead. We probably do that too much. It's a real discipline to practice the presence of the moment, and people have to struggle to do that in meditation and using other tools. So the solar mind does look ahead a lot, looks ahead and looks back, remembers. But the lunar mind also looks ahead, and according to Jung at least, has a prospective orientation and reaches out toward a future, but thinks about perhaps a different future from what the solar mind has in its prospects. The prospective function of the lunar mind can make contributions to consciousness by raising possibilities that through this hyper-associative process that it engages in, raises possibilities for futures that the solar mind in its practicality and its reality sense would not dream of. And so this is a value also of consulting the lunar mind, that it opens our mind. It makes it more creative. The associations go further. They come from left field. They're off the wall. They're strange to our solar consciousness. But they have a bearing on our lives. And the object is to put the two together and that to take into account the fact that the lunar mind knows things and knows of things that the solar mind doesn't know, or doesn't know well enough, or overlooks, or underrates. So Jung says that the unconscious compensates. Dreams compensate. In other words, they bring something into our awareness that we've overlooked, or we've underrated, or we've overrated ourselves, and so it creates a balance and brings forward an emotional element that we may have not taken adequately into consideration. And this is why Jungians will often say, I need to sleep on it before I make a decision. Because our solar mind can go very fast. It's very directed. We can say yes too quickly. We can say no too quickly based on very narrow assumptions. You wait a bit and let your dreaming mind have a say in it. You might get a very different picture, and in the end, make a more balanced decision if you take both into account. So in the analytic process, we try to bring both to bear on the problems that we face, the everyday problems in our relationships, in our work situations, and in deeper questions about the meaning of our lives, our fate, our destiny, all those kinds of very deep issues that come into a long and fruitful Jungian analysis. I'm going to close with one more dream.
Search out there, yeah.
this compensatory function of dreaming, the compensatory function of dreaming can help people to separate, create separations, individuate in the sense of separating, becoming more individual, less dependent, fewer projections onto other people, and so on. It can also help to integrate parts of the self that have been rejected or pushed away, shadow aspects, by bringing those into consciousness. And finally, it can help us to connect to what I quoted from Jung here just a moment ago as the unitary soul of humanity. And I want to give you a final dream that is an illustration of that, how a dream of this particular person connected her and me, who was sitting there listening to the dream, to the unus mundus, or the anima mundi, the unitary soul of humanity. Here's the dream. This is dreamt by a very highly psychologically developed woman in her early 60s. And so it's a product of a psyche that has been well cultivated, and this is a very advanced dream, as you will see. And I will just give a brief commentary on it, and then I will turn the microphone over to Margaret. She says, I find myself in a large throng of people who are milling around, moving slowly from one area to another, as though at a garden party. A lot of people in a garden, walking around, talking to each other as one does. Gradually, I become aware of a strange thing happening close to the ground. Close to the ground and around our feet, a powerful charge of energy is moving rapidly among the people in a figure 8. It dawns on me that this energy has a form, this figure 8, and then I see it as an enormous snake. The snake's beautiful face appears to me. It has the head of a beautiful woman. The enormous body of the snake is covered with white orchids, which are growing out of her. And she confronts me, this snake, and her giant face comes near. Her dark eyes fix me in a stare. And of course, I'm afraid. Beyond the fear, though, I feel tremendous awe and wonder at this marvelous and awesome being. Who are you? She demands of me. What do you do? I give my name and tell her that I'm a psychotherapist. Oh, so you are an architect of souls, she says. I'm surprised at this designation and listen further. She goes on, you are like Julius Caesar, and names a bunch of other people I can't remember when I awake. She must see the look of astonishment on my face, because she goes on to say, of course you could not know that. He was an architect of souls in a much earlier lifetime. I now understand that this snake has been around since the beginning of time. Her memory holds a record of all the souls who have ever lived, and of all their various incarnations and specific identities. Some souls have lived more than once, or even many times. I'm surprised that she has placed me in the category with Julius Caesar, and even more astonished that his underlying identity was an architect of souls. Clearly, I do not understand something important here. I'm dumbfounded and shaken to be meeting a consciousness that has been around since the universe began. For a time, we simply look at each other. I admire the beautiful white orchids that cover her massive body. I also realize that she is immensely powerful and could annihilate me in an instant. But I decide to take a risk anyway, and I venture to say to her, you, to the snake, you now have an opportunity to do great good because you are at a point in your evolution where you are on the verge of becoming fully conscious. You are more than halfway there. Surprised at my boldness, I wonder how she will take this comment. Her face lights up and she smiles. This is a blessing, and great streams of energy are exuding from her. Well, that was the dream that she had, and it left her with a feeling of awe and wonder, of course, to have met this world snake in her dream, linking and connecting her to human history in such a profound way, but also with a great question. There's a mystery in it. What is this hyper-association between her and Julius Caesar? So this led to some serious study of ancient history and trying to figure out what is her connection of her soul to Julius Caesar. And that's the way dreams are. They leave you with big questions sometimes, but also with a feeling of profound connection to the depths of humanity and to the cosmos. And this is what Jung talked about as the third stage of the conjunctio, uniting with the anima mundi. It's a very advanced stage of individuation, and it's offered to this person in the form of a dream. So I will stop there. My time is up, and thank you for your attention, and look forward to hearing Margaret's comments. I can see you there, Margaret.
Wow, thank you very much, Murray. Really appreciate that. Boy, wonderful talk. I've got a number of questions, both email and I'm sure there's people around here. I'm wondering, why don't we have Margaret give your talk, and then we'll leave some time for questions, and maybe we'll group the questions together. So we'll do Margaret's talk, and then do questions from internets and the various sites after that. Margaret, would that be okay? Do you feel good to go right in the talk, or do you want to pause? Okay, so let's do that. We'll pause for questions when you're done. Well, good. So take it away, Margaret.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say how honoured I am to be invited to take part in this exciting experience, and to welcome colleagues across the world to the Northern School of Child and Adolescent Psychotherapy in Leeds, England. Just to say, I'm a Jungian analyst who chanced on neurobiology, really because I was working with a lot of patients with early relational trauma, and I began to see that the research that was coming out of neurobiology and out of attachment research had a great deal to offer to help me to understand how to work. So that's how I come to be sitting here today. When we dream, we experience vivid visual imagery, which enables us to begin to process emotional states of mind previously unavailable to consciousness, just in the way that Hobson described. Emergent metaphor has long been one of the most powerful vehicles by which the self may achieve greater integration, and we've heard two lovely dreams describing very different aspects of that. Nowhere is this effect more marked than in the work that emerges from the dreaming process. Daniel's comments, "Dreams have served my creative purpose both as alarm clocks and teddy bears. They wake me to new awareness of the shackles left from my unfortunate childhood, and by continually providing evidence of my current psychological landscape, they give me the information and courage to advance both consciously and unconsciously." Jung stressed that any threat from the unconscious diminishes as soon as the patient begins to assimilate contents that were previously unconscious. He concludes, "That is why every dream is an organ of information and control, and why dreams are our most effective aid in building up the personality." He reminds us that in the dream, the psyche speaks in images and gives expression to instincts that derive from the most primitive levels of nature, which lead the patient back to the natural law of his own being. The emergent metaphors contained in dreams herald metamorphosis, the capacity for healthy change in the mind, enabling a more coherent sense of self. So first of all, dreams as metaphors. Dreams can be understood as metaphors that enrich the mind. Jung likened the dream to the theatre, in which the dreamer is himself the scene, the player, the prompter, the producer, the author, the public, and the critic. Dream metaphor reflects the particular preoccupations of the dreamer and the underlying complexes that drive these preoccupations. Hartmann explains that as we move along our continuum from focused waking thought, the solar mind, Murray's described, to dreaming, the lunar mind, our mental processes become increasingly metaphoric. He argues that a dream provides the explanatory metaphor for the dominant emotion or concern of the dreamer. Mancia suggests that the function of the dream is to create images that are able to fill the void of non-representation, representing symbolically experiences that were originally pre-symbolic. Dream metaphors emerge as the normal functions of logical solar thought and processing vanish in the face of vivid dream experiences. Hartmann suggests that this is because the neural nets that are activated in the dreaming process are much looser than the tightly woven nets that deal with linguistic or mathematical functioning of the awake and focused mind. The dreaming mind-brain's use of emergent metaphor allows the possibility of an encounter between conscious and unconscious. Such an encounter with the symbolic facilitates the individuation process so dear to Jung's heart. Cambray and Carter describe dream analysis as a co-constructive process evolving within an ongoing containing relationship. They understand the dream as a communication of a psychic state at a particular moment. And they emphasize that critical for therapeutic value, if we're wanting to use them as therapists, is that the dreamer discovers or recovers in the analytic process the affective experience residing in the dream. In therapy, the dream is in a sense experienced together, as implicit speaks to implicit in the analytic dyad. Out of this shared experience, well-timed verbal interpretations may develop, enabling implicit to become explicit. John Beebe urges great care in the way in which we interpret dreams. He illustrates his point by identifying 3 different kinds of nightmares and arguing that each requires a different sort of response from the analyst. Cambray and Carter urge that the approach used to enter and engage someone's symbolic reality must seek to stay near the creative edge. Easier said than done. And at this point, I want to present a dream concerned with change, with movement. A dream that's in some ways the epitome of the function of dreams and the dreaming process. It's a dream that looks backward in a developmental manner, you might say, and forward, not only indicating to the dreamer aspects of the self that she might move on to realize, but also indicating the need to explore the past, the shadow, which is unconsciously known. And the patient chose to have her name changed to Xanthi. Xanthi, I more recently found out, was the wife of the goddess of healing, the god of healing, Asclepius. So a good name. The patient, a woman in her late 30s, was married and has children. She was a high achiever, a successful career woman with a first-class degree. She struggled with a quite fierce superego. Perhaps in compensation, she chose extra training in order to be able to work with dysfunctional families. She came to once-a-week therapy for a number of years, and after much thought and feeling that the children were now old enough for her to be able to manage it, she began to think about entering a 4 times a week analysis. She wanted it to be for herself, but she knew there was also a serious possibility that she might later seek to train as an analyst. We spoke about what both might entail. And after the session she went home and that night dreamt the following dream. I was looking for a house. I was on the top of a bus with a companion near a park in the centre of a city that I knew well from childhood. Further on were the buildings of the university. Beyond them was my school, and below it a rather run-down part of the town. The bus paused at a crossroads, waiting for a green light. I looked down, and right on the corner of the crossroads, I saw the beautiful facade of a double-fronted Georgian house. I felt seriously interested in buying this house. We got off the bus and went to have a look. My companion began to show me around the outside. At the side of the house was a row of stables. There were 6 boxes, each with a horse looking out of it. They would each require care. I went round the back and was not entirely surprised to find that the back of the building was in a state of disrepair. However, I felt it was not beyond repair. I became seriously interested in purchasing it, in getting the chance to live in it. In the dream, we may note the impressive persona of this patient, reflected in the impressive facade of the building, contrasting strongly with what's at first unseen, which is the back of the building, in such a state of disrepair, with stabled horses representing the need for drive and energy to be taken care of. While looking down from the bus reflects my patient's tendency to retreat into defensive objectivity, I was heartened to hear that she had alighted from the bus with a companion, whom later she identified as probably you. She began to explore the building more closely, demonstrating commitment to the kind of journey that Jung proposes. I asked my patient what she'd made of the dream. She told me the dream again, adding that the price tag for the house had been £6 million. She said, I felt it was expensive, but nevertheless should be seriously considered. She said, I thought of the $6 million man. He got destructed. His past was gone. Smiling broadly, she added, but then he was made anew and he could do anything. Maybe that's what would happen in 4 times a week analysis, because that's expensive too, isn't it? Only he was a robotic man, and the aim of analysis would not be to become robotic. I talked about the training with my husband, about how expensive it might be, but I found I was still interested. I'm lucky in that we could manage financially. 6 million. She continued, I don't understand about the horses. I commented, I think we did mention 6 years of analysis. And she replied, oh yes, that's right. And an analysis is to do with feelings, with the passions. Maybe that's what the horses are about. You know, in Plato. I think it's in Phaedrus. About the horses as passions, about driving in the sky. And I thought of Jung, I thought of this dream when Murray referred to Jung's white horse dream. Later, as I reflected on the session, I remembered how my patient became more animated. I found myself thinking of Jung's description of the horse as dynamic and vehicular power that carries one away like a surge of instinct, and Hillman's comment that animals wake up the imagination. Animal dreams provoke feelings that make us more instinctually alive. And of the horse in particular, they belong to the airy element. It is as if all horses had wings, flying through the wind, tail streaming, nostrils flared wide. But I also remembered that at the time the horses in Xanthi's dreams were stabled, not yet owned, needing care and attention. In the next session, she began to talk about the area where the house was. She experienced it as a place where opposites met. On the one side, her father's world of the university, but contrasting strongly with the other side, just below her school, where a rather seedy part of the city was, a rather shady shadow area, where she was uncertain whether to venture. She knew her parents wouldn't have wished her to explore it. We went on to explore a little of her fears concerning the nature of analysis, her fear of me as an analyst who might treat her in the way the robotic man was treated, the reminder it carried of her parents' overdetermined way of controlling her future. She felt they'd decided who she would be, where she might study. At 8 years old, she'd literally known which Oxbridge College her parents had in mind for her, that they would determine what she might become, and how she feared that I might be like that with her if she came to analysis 4 times a week. Jacobi notes that a dream may provide imagery which stems from a patient's fantasy and which shows her unconscious expectation of the analyst. Peter Fonagy comments, it's now widely recognised that there's a critical transferential aspect to the interpretation of dreams. Dreams are not produced in isolation, but are often dreamt with the analyst in mind. Now I want to turn to dreams as dissociative phenomena, which nevertheless have an integrative function. Many researchers now adopt a stance that understands dissociation from a much broader perspective than previously, and they understand the sleep process as an essentially dissociative state of mind, all dreams as dissociative phenomena. Such a view considers the dissociative strategy to be part of the normal functioning of the mind-brain, as it screens out the non-essential in order to maintain optimum functioning. Jung took a stance concerning dream content that is in keeping with this current theory concerning dissociation. He understood dreams as compensatory products of the unconscious that sought to help the dreamer understand aspects of his or her own inner world, of which he or she was not yet aware, and which would be helpful to know about. Jung said, dreams don't deceive, they don't lie, they don't distort or disguise, they naively announce what they are and what they mean. They're invariably seeking to express something that the ego does not know, does not understand. My dad cannot understand. He felt that dreams put the dreamer in touch with aspects of his or her inner world which were currently unavailable to the conscious mind. Bromberg suggests, for some patients, dream images may at first be thought of as a transitional experience that allows the potential linking of self-states that are disconnected, permitting the voices of other self-states to be heard and to find access to the dynamic structure that the patient defines as me. Is that the task of the dream maker? Is this the dream maker at work? Jung understood every dream to be essentially integrative in nature, bringing dissociated aspects of experience and being into conscious mind. But what about the neural substrates of the dreaming process? Well, Bar Yam points out the obvious, really, that the mind-brain's active but isolated from sensory neurons and sensory input. We really do get to know our own inner selves when the outer world is shut out, when we're in the dreaming state. He speculates that during sleep, the mind further subdivides into isolated neuronal groups, and it's this that makes possible the breaking up of experience from waking period into the pieces that become the building blocks for creative learning, which enable adaptive response to future circumstance. Rossi explains that just as negative states of emotional arousal can lead to the overproduction of stress proteins and illness, so positive psychological experience in the dreaming process can facilitate gene expression, neurogenesis, problem solving and healing. He stresses the role of the ZIF268 learning gene in rapid eye movement sleep, and he draws our attention to animal studies in which this gene is expressed after animals have been allowed novel, enriching experience, and that this gene expression results in growth and change in the very structure of the pathways in the mind-brain. So it's the dream maker in part, remaking mind. Ribeiro concludes, the function of dreams is to trim and shape memories acquired during waking in a cyclic process of creation, selection, and generalization about the world. It seems that one result of such processing is that through metaphor, unconscious contents of the mind are conveyed to consciousness. Despite the amnesia associated with dreaming, that awful, well, I just can't quite remember my dream, it's become clear that dreaming has a vital role to play in the affective organization of memory. Reiser explains, each of us carries an enduring network of stored memories encoded by images perceived during significant emotional life experiences. Such images and the memories they encode are associationally linked by a shared potential to evoke highly similar or even identical complexes of emotion. Such networks are organized around a core of perceptual images or part images that encode memories of early events. Panksepp concludes, REM sleep, dreaming sleep, may help to solidify the many unconscious habits that are the very foundation of our personality. In the final accounting, dreams may construct the powerful subconscious or preconscious affective psychological patterns that make us the people that we are. They may help to construct the many emotional myths and beliefs around which our lives revolve. Thus, dreaming, arising from a state that's fundamentally dissociative, may yet be said to refresh and revitalize the mind-brain in an associative and integrative manner. Studies on PET scans do indeed reveal the highly selective regional activation pattern of the brain in REM sleep. Brain imaging studies reveal that vivid visual dreams light up the visual cortex, as one might expect. Nightmares trigger activity in the amygdala, and the hippocampus flares up from time to time to relay recent events. The areas which seem to be most commonly active are the pathways carrying alerting signals from the brainstem and the auditory cortex, supplementary motor areas, and visual association areas. It's those, all of which together combine to give you that virtual reality effect of dreaming. Major groups of researchers note that in REM sleep, the limbic system, the emotional system, especially the amygdala, is activated, while the frontal or executive areas of the brain are deactivated. And so they therefore assign, as Murray's made clear, a significant role to REM sleep in the processing of emotion. Hobson, as we've heard, concludes that anxiety, elation, and anger are the major shapers of dream plots. He adds, for the reform-minded psychoanalyst, this should be heard as the brain music of divine inspiration, because it implies that the recall of dreams permits the impact of emotion on cognition to be understood. The exact nature of the biochemical and regional differences in dreaming from waking states preoccupies many researchers, who reach very different conclusions. As Murray explained, Hobson emphasized the role of the cholinergic system in the dreaming process. He argued that dreaming activity begins in the brainstem, progresses through the limbic system, finally reaching the medial frontal cortex, while the executive portions of the frontal cortex remain less active. Mark Soames suggested that dreaming is generated by a different mechanism from the one that generates REM sleep itself. He understands the activation of the dopaminergic system to be crucial to the generation of the actual dream in all sleep states. Braun, on the other hand, argues that neither the cholinergic nor the dopaminergic hypothesis will prove to be the sole explanation for the dreaming process. In other words, it's not either or, it's both and, probably. The pattern of activity may actually be driven by differential patterns of information transfer between cortex and thalamus. Domhoff goes down a different route and suggests that it's most helpful to consider the features that dreaming shares with both normal waking cognition, that's the area that Murray's talked about of fantasy thinking, lunar thinking, and waking hallucinatory thinking. Normal waking cognition is the solar thinking. Waking hallucinatory thinking is more the lunar. And to blend the two with a thorough knowledge of dream content. In other words, it's an extremely complex task, and it isn't explained by any one hormonal bath. Be that as it may, all seem to agree that the dream is in a unique way the expression of the internal intrapsychic world of the dreamer. There's no way a patient can better get to know themselves, or we can better get to know our patients. Inevitably, expression of this inner world emerges in metaphorical images. Metaphors act as windows to the psyche, to the soul, to the self. And I've found that emergent metaphor encountered in the dreaming process is often developed in a powerful way through very vivid images. Evolving symbolizations emerge in a series of dream images, one thing gradually being revealed as standing for another, carrying with it the capacity to enable change into a more mature state of being. Such metaphors stimulate brain activity. Such processing, utilizing brain plasticity, brings with it more possibility of change than any other form of human communication. Sometimes a dream series will be spread over time and will contain frightening images, which, as the therapy progresses, metamorphose into something more human and accessible. I want to introduce you to Holly, who sought to capture something of her dream images visually. These lunar images were remarkable in that they played a transforming role by functioning as the stepping stones by which she became able to put difficult feelings into words. She was a patient about in her mid-40s, one of several professional artists that I've seen over the years. She experienced extremely potent visual dream images. At one point, the easiest way for her to convey these was through making pictures. At the time the first of these was made, our work was dominated by Holly's experience of me as a hostile, persecuting, destructive mother analyst. I carried the projection of her internalized, destructive, and persecuting mother. It seemed that the internal mother was very much in the image of her own mother. Holly had hardly any memories from her earliest childhood, and few that included her mother. She felt she'd always displeased her mother, who left her in no doubt about this, attacking her verbally and occasionally physically. And recent research from the trauma field has shown that persistent verbal abuse of children is one of the most damaging forms of abuse, and one that we've underplayed and undervalued in our analytic work. She remembered her mother as an angry person and would often lie awake in bed at night listening to her parents quarrelling, particularly to her mother's raging voice. Holly was sent away to school and was desperately unhappy there. At school, her elder sister seemed to take on her mother's mantle. To Holly, it seemed that together with her friends, her sister used her seniority as a prefect as an excuse to persecute Holly, bullying her at every opportunity. Holly failed dismally at school, left as soon as possible, married young, had children, and only much later, with the help of therapy, was able to embark on higher education and a career. This is the therapy before she was with me. When Holly came to see me for the first time, she was in a state of seeming numbness and confusion, impelled by a most overwhelming loss that had occurred in her life recently. Her underlying rage and fury were expressed in her first remark. She experienced the rocky millstone grit moor edge, which towers above the village that I was working in then, from time immemorial. You have to imagine the Peak District and the Pennine Way, if any of you have visited that part of England, with very fierce edges. She commented, "Isn't it frightening to be here? Isn't it dangerous? It was frightening driving along beneath the edge. I thought the huge black rocks would come crashing onto my car. They don't look safe. It looks like they could crash down on us." Often when she became fearful of me, she would build a pile of pillows on the couch between her and me, so she couldn't see me and I couldn't see her. She experienced the rocky edge on the way to that first session, much as she'd often experienced her mother, and would come to experience me in the rocky edge of the transference, and I her in the countertransference. In the sessions as we worked together, in a moment it seemed she would suddenly change. Her face would for a moment show fear, and then would become utterly hard as she closed off completely from me. For Holly, sometimes just too strong a tone in my voice, the use of what Jana Williams has described as primary, not pastel colours, in my way of speaking, would remind her of her strident, over-intrusive and fearsome mother. Almost a whole session would pass as she would struggle with her experience of me as the bad mother. Wordlessness was the most striking feature of her state of being at those times, as she became dominated by right brain functioning, by deeply held ways of being and behaving, arising out of the traumatic quality of her earliest relational experience, lodged deep in implicit right brain memory, emerging through lunar mind. A turning point came when Holly went home and painted a picture of a dream. The dream had been of a fearsome black cat mauling a baby cat which was covered in blood. It filled her with fear, but she was able to bring it to the session, and it enabled her to begin to engage the left hemisphere of the brain as she thought about material emerging from the right. Haltingly, she was able to discuss her uncertainty about whether I was the bad black cat mother attacking her, or whether she was a bad black cat tearing me to shreds. Hillman reminds us, the dream animal shows us that the imagination has jaws and paws, that it can wake us in the night with panic and terror, or move us to tears. Through the image, Holly and I became able to talk about how aggression becomes internalized, how the experience of both being abused and being the abuser inhabited her internal world. Towards the end of the session, we noticed a little cream cat hidden in the centre of the picture, which we felt symbolized the child carrying hope. This little cat was uncannily like a much-loved little female cat that I had at the time, that the patient had never seen or known about consciously. A little cream Siamese cat with orange ears and blue eyes. That's quite specific. And my little cream cat, called Plum. And it certainly made me hope. So the patient had, at an unconscious level, caught into my mind, into my inner being, and found the image that would evoke not only fear and knowledge about anger, but contain within it the seed of hope. Very, very powerful dream image. For me, the little female cat was an indication of a softening of her primitive splitting mechanism. It brought me hope that her anger would no longer only be able to be experienced in projection. For Holly, the dream image brought the possibility of putting angry feelings into words as we looked at the image together. And for the first time, she began to be able to speak about her anger. It was the first of many pictures that she was to make at home and bring to therapy. Some, such as this one, she would bring immediately. Others would arrive after several months, and in the case of two of them, several years after their making. One day, some months later, after the first picture, Holly came into the room saying to me, "Some people dream vividly with long stories. I can never bring dreams like that. I only dream in snippets." And I replied, perhaps if you had a book and kept a record of those snippets, they might begin to make some sense for you. And here I was hoping that the act of writing might help to make the meaningful links, or lead to being able to make meaningful links. One might describe the next phase of work that came as fostering neural integration through verbal interpretation of evolving images that were coming from implicit and body memory, their emergence indicating, real desire for contact, to connect, for attachment, and a changed kind of attachment. Holly began to describe the snippet dream. She said, "Well, last night I dreamt of a vase and I was trying really hard to clean it. What meaning could there possibly be in that?" I replied more directively than I would ordinarily, because I sensed that it was really important to make some sense of the image for her. So I said, "Well, for starters, what does the vase symbolize?" And after a pause, I added, "Is it something to do with being a container?" "Maybe," she replied. And I said, "Well, yesterday We were talking about the difficult relationship you had with your mother and how she made you feel you were a no-good, bad baby from the beginning. It's been so difficult for you to know whether you were a bad baby or whether it was actually your mum who was in difficulties. Holly asked anxiously, I was trying to scrub the outside. Wherever one would want to scrub the outside of the vase. Why the outside? So I said, but isn't that what you're often trying to do? Wanting to look good on the outside, trying to please the other person, just as you so long to please your mother and for her to see you and to love you. The next session, Holly felt confident enough to bring another dream, which she still called a snippet, but it was slightly fuller, and it involved her current attachment relationships. Through her engagement in the therapeutic relationship, Holly sought to process her experience of another in a different way to that portrayed in the original dream. She longed to be a loved and valued child. Perhaps she might not always be seen as bad or dirty. Around this time, she showed me a painting which she had actually made much earlier in the analysis. It showed Holly sitting on the couch with two images of me sitting side by side in the room. In the more dominant image in the foreground, I have a clock for a face. And the time it showed was the time our sessions ended. Was I sitting there, longing for her to leave? Holly wondered. Sitting behind the clock face, uninterested, bored analyst, was a fainter picture of me, with a real face this time, listening attentively and looking rather anxious. That this figure was fainter seemed to indicate that it was an aspect of me that was still in the shadows of her other experience of me. The picture reflected her uncertainty. Was I like her mum? Did I see her as no good? Was I just waiting to get rid of her at the end of each session, just as her mum had packed her off to boarding school? Would she prove too much for me? Or might she actually become able to experience and internalize someone who sat with her and listened attentively? Because the making of mind is an implicit, emergent and relational process, traumatic complexes, or splinter psyches as Jung called them, form when the psyche is presented with inassimilable experience, resulting in undigested contents. In the next complex metaphorical picture, Holly was again struggling with her perception of our relationship. And here there was a figure, a dark figure with her back to me, the bad black cat mother probably, but beginning to be more human in a somewhat Picasso-esque sort of way. There's a mouth that's open and can speak, a rather fierce mouth that might bite, much as her mother's remarks had been biting, and a meat cleaver representing anger is held behind her back. As I look closely at the picture with Holly, I note to myself with horror that the cleaver is about to fall on the little cream cat that's now taken a slight human form, albeit an emaciated one, and bears a crown of thorns. The theme of victim, abuser, and need for rescuer was to play out over many, many sessions in the transference and countertransference relationships. As the therapy moved into its final phase, Holly began to bring images that were more indicative of neural integration. The first was an image of an attachment from which a child might begin to look out at the world a little more confidently, the beginnings of a coherent sense of self within. As we looked at this painting together, I noticed it was painted on a paper that had a rather rough, raised surface. I wondered aloud why Holly might have chosen that paper. She replied, "Oh, it was the first piece of paper I pulled out of my drawer." Almost instantly her mood changed, and from being companionably at ease, she felt criticised and a failure. She said, "I've spoiled it. It's no good. Oh, well, maybe I'll do it again." In turn, I quickly felt I was an insensitive, no-good therapist mother who in a few words had managed to spoil the picture for my patient, what had been a good experience of making something. As she left, she murmured half-heartedly, "Oh, well, maybe I'll do it again." But she arrived, to my great pleasure, the next week and almost immediately said, "You know that picture?" And I said, "Yes," remembering well my previous mistake. She said, "I decided I wouldn't do the picture again. It's on rough paper, but I thought to myself, it's actually an appropriate choice because it's been a rough road." Once again, I marvelled at the pertinence and healing power of the symbolic. And I'll tell you just in conclusion that a final picture came when she painted a new image of a mother with her child held securely in her arms, the child reaching up to touch her face, her mother's face, gently. It seemed to portray the new attachment that she'd found as a result of the repeated experiences of rupture and repair in therapy, an attachment that I've come to call learned secure. Holly spoke of this picture in relation to the last one. She said that although in some ways the new one seemed quite primitive and the colours quite crude, she felt it marked the completion of the process. She felt both mother and child had become more human. She had become able to experience and speak freely of these images from her internal world as symbolizing aspects of herself. She liked it that the child was able to reach out and touch the mother's face in a loving way. She felt that her inner child might at last begin to feel more secure. She felt it was important her anger was still in the picture, in the form of the little black cat that was there, but that it was now in manageable proportions. She said that the little black cat, which was how she thought of the picture, reminded her of a cat they'd had when she was a teenager, a really nice cat. She remembered it had been called Togo. Earlier in the same week that she brought this picture, she'd said to me for the first time she could conceive that therapy could actually end and she could take me away inside her. And so I said to her that perhaps Togo had something to do with to go and signalled the end of the therapy. And internally I thought to myself the arrival of self-regulation that would permit the possibility of termination. She said she'd wondered whether the heart that she'd put in the picture, she'd painted it in February, might be a bit naive, but she'd felt it was the way that people ordinarily spoke about love and affection. I found myself thinking that the baby's earliest experience of the warmth of the mother's body, the comfort of the rhythm of her heart, the warmth that had grown between us. And she spoke finally about the snowdrops that she'd put blooming in the bottom left corner of the picture. It seemed that in the realm of the unconscious hope had flowered, that the bitter winter, ruled over by the wicked Ice Queen, no longer had her in its thrall. The making, bringing and discussion of these dream pictures, representative of the symbolic work that's the stuff of analysis, made crystal clear to me that for Holly it was the relational style of Jungian psychoanalysis, with its capacity to address early trauma deep in the implicit memory store, that was crucial to the successful process of change. And I hope that the dreams I've invited you to consider have provided clinical illustration of the compatibility of the neuroscientific view of dreaming with a contemporary Jungian approach to dream analysis. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret. Really appreciate especially the clinical insights they've offered to us today. It's wonderful to get the European perspective from Zurich and England. What I love about England and the analytical psychologists there are how much you look at the transference, countertransference, in this case the dream pieces with that. Thank you so much. Looking at time, we've got about 10 minutes left before we take the break. We might push that a little bit farther. We might do 15 minutes maybe if we can. But I do want to leave a generous break so people can go grab something to eat and come back at hour's time. Let's see if we can get perhaps a question from each of our sites in. And this can be either to Murray or Margaret, so feel free to ask questions to either. We'll go to probably Sonoma first, so if Sonoma can be thinking, then perhaps here in Asheville, Zurich, and then London, and maybe get a question from each site. There's a few internet questions which I might ask now. We're in the next section. So let's first go to Sonoma. Sonoma, are you there? Any question or comment from Murray or Margaret?
I just wanted to... we have a bit of a feedback loop here, but I'm just going to continue. Thanks. I wanted to thank both Murray and Margaret for their presentations. I'm really struck in hearing both presentations about Murray's initial question about the dream maker, and then thinking about consciousness. Jung said at one point that consciousness are the eyes of deity. And there's something about dreams enable us to take in and heal not just the personal experiences, but the transpersonal field too, and to bring it all in, as if it allows us to push beyond the personal within consciousness. And there's something so healing and reparative about that too. We track the brain neurochemical changes, but there's also something else happening. And so that's my kind of question here. I don't know if either Murray or Margaret wants to say anything about it, but the near-death experience consciousness researchers say that we don't even need the brain to have consciousness. And I might be getting into a black hole here, but Murray or Margaret, do you want to say anything about that?
Murray?
Yes, yeah. I'm glad to make a comment.
Press the button, Murray.
Can you hear me?
Well,
yes.
We can. And make sure to mute microphone sites that aren't talking. You can mute your microphones.
There is a short quote from Jung in a late work, Mysterium Conjunctionis, just one sentence I'd like to read. The psychic is a phenomenal world in itself, which can be reduced neither to the brain nor to metaphysics. And what we deal with in Jungian analysis, of course, but also just looking at dreams in any context, is really the psychic world. And this is a world that connects, obviously, to our body and to the material world, and also relates to our solar mind, and it relates to a vast network of associations that go way beyond the personal and out into the collective, what Jung called the collective unconscious, and into the cosmos. So I think if you take a dream image and work with it, you can make the personal connections very intimate, immediate connections to your own life history, to your childhood, to your complexes and your patterns. And if you keep going with it and working it, it can also extend out into much greater territories that are not personal, but are collective, cultural, and perhaps even transpersonal. For instance, that vase, I was struck by Holly's dream of polishing the vase. And my association to that, which is a slightly bizarre one because I've read Jung so much, but it's to alchemy. And there's a section in Psychology and Alchemy where Jung talks about the vase, the vase, the vase bene clausum. It was the container of the alchemical process itself. And he gives a lot of quotations about this vase from alchemists, and he says the vase was itself the mystery. The vase was the lapis. The vase was the self, was the secret of the whole process. And so polishing the vase is like taking care of the self. It's like a good mother taking care of the infant. And what this dreamer is being led to by that dream of polishing the vase, taking such care of the vase, outer, inner, is not just to look good, I think, but to take care of something precious, the soul. Now that can be her own personal soul. It can be the soul of the world. It can be the soul of her family. It can go in many directions, depending on where she is in her life, what one can do with that interpretively in an analytic session. But I think that was a marvelous dream, really showing that she was ready to take care of the central mystery. And that will unfold in all kinds of directions in her life. So I think interpretation is very important. How one interprets, what kind of interpretation a patient is ready for. I think it's very good to start with the personal and connect the meaning of a dream very carefully to personal history, and then also to perhaps reflect on it in the kind of sense that you're talking about that goes beyond the personal and into the culture and into the world and even into the cosmic mystery.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Question here in Asheville. So go ahead, make sure you push the button to make your light green and ask your question.
Yeah, this is Max in Knoxville. Murray, this would be a question for you, a two-part question about dreams and the future. A lot of what we've talked about seems to have an immediate or indirect function on the future of kind of healing, whether it be separations or integrations or even touching the collective unconscious. But you seem to provide a more direct connection as you, at the end of your talk, said the solar mind looks ahead a lot. The lunar does also. The perspective function of the lunar mind can contribute to the solar by raising possibilities of the future. Two-part question. I'd like you to say more about the perspective function of dreams, and then I'd also like you to touch upon the predictive function, the aspect of dreams that lines up with events that come to pass. And if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit about the perspective function and the predictive function.
Okay, be glad
And
to.
all in 2 minutes. Good luck with that. Did you get the question, Mark?
I'm going to fall back on Jung here and say that it seems like what this hyperassociativity of the dreaming mind can do is put together associations in a way that the waking mind would either find bizarre or not come to. Connections can be made and narratives told and pictures created that can have a possible bearing on the future. I think it's thinking ahead. The mind is thinking ahead, and it's thinking in a way that takes possibilities into account, and sometimes they come about. So if they come about, we say the dream was predictive. It was a precognitive dream. It foresaw the future. If it doesn't come about, we say, well, it was just symbolic. And I don't think at the moment that you have the dream, you can tell what it's going to be. I think it's only in retrospect that you can say, wow, the dream seemed to know ahead of time what was going to happen the next day or the next year, or what was unfolding. And, of course, I think on a deep inner level, the dreams are preparing the individual for a future. I think the unconscious is preparing us for a future all the time with intuition, with hunches, with guesses, and sometimes those are correct and sometimes they're not. But there is a process of putting together possible futures going on in our psyche, shows itself in our intuitions, our fantasies, and our dreams. Now, predictive, I wouldn't be so sure about it. But I would take it as an option. Maybe this will be the way things develop in the future. It's a hypothesis. I would hold it as a possibility, but not as a hard prediction.
Well, thank you. Murray, quick question. You all will be signing off at the break, right? You won't be
That's right.
attending?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yes. Yes.
So let me offer at least one last question with the Zurich. Do you have an audience there that would like to ask any questions, or how are you all there?
Small audience. Anne, do you have a question? This is Anne. She has just graduated from ISOP a couple of weeks ago. She is going to be the first fully qualified Jungian analyst in Taiwan. She's
Wow.
from Taiwan, and she just graduated and will be going back, I assume, to Taiwan to practice. So congratulations, Anne.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Is the microphone on?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just because I have no background of my background is literature, so about the neuroscience, I'm really new and I'm not familiar with this area. And so when Mary, you talk about the topic, who makes dreams and what does the dream means. And then I wrote down this sentence. It's a Jung, you quote from Jung. He said the dream reflects not on the ego but on the self. And this sentence make me think, give me the feeling that that self itself is paradoxically as the center and at the whole at the same time from this sentence. And then from Margaret, at the end, you mentioned about from the perspective of neuroscience, you mentioned about the self-regulation system will bring the balance back to the individual. And so I'm just have a very innocent question that I don't know, maybe whether you can talk about more this self, the definition of self. Whether we have a little bit different from the perspective of Jungian perspective or the neuroscience perspective. Whether it's the same or will be a little bit slight difference. I'm just curious about this question.
So this is a question about the definition of the self. I don't know that in neuroscience they discuss the self so much, or if they do, I think it's a great mystery at all levels. I mean, to my knowledge, neuroscience hasn't been able to discover how the brain in and of itself can produce a self. Self-awareness, self-consciousness, reflection upon itself. This is a great mystery. But the Jungian self is a much bigger construct, you could say, than what one usually thinks of as the self or the ego and its surroundings. That, of course, goes out to include the psyche as a whole. Now, who is the dream maker? Jung would say, if you want a one-word answer, it's the self. The self is producing dreams, is arranging dreams, is creating stories and scenarios, sending us messages that we need, sending us compensations. What the self really wants is this self-regulation and balance. Okay, and the self is in charge of the body, the self is in charge of the brain, the self is in charge of the psyche. It's all organized by the self, and the self is not only resident in the brain, it's throughout the body and possibly beyond the body, most likely beyond the body. So I'd say that the self is using your body, using your brain, sending you messages in the form of dreams to help you with your life. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. Slightly metaphysical, but Jung would say that's a hypothesis, and you can look at it that way. And if you do look at it that way, I think it will give you a particular way of working with your dreams that will help you individuate. what the Jungian analyst is really interested in at the end of the day is this patient individuating? And can I use the dreams and interpret the dream in such a way that it will foster the individuation of the patient? That is the main concern. And so this notion of individuation, development toward wholeness, is really the driving force behind Jungian interpretations of dreams or most anything. And I think it's a very health-promoting way of interpreting dreams. And you saw that in Margaret's work, too, that she sees the dreams as very health-promoting, integrative, overcoming splitting, producing balance and self-balance. I think that's a very classic Jungian position.
Well, thank
Steve,
you.
I think we've run out of time.
Yeah, we probably should go and take a break. It's about 5 or 6 minutes after. Let's try to reconvene at the top of the hour for those sites coming back. So I know that's a little bit shorter break, 54 minutes or so. If you need to stay a little bit longer and come in late, you certainly can. A couple warnings. Microphones sometimes stay on at the break. So 2 things. Please mute any microphone you can. And second of all, don't have a private conversation in the room you're in, because there's a chance we broadcast all over the globe, and that's happened before. So please mute or go outside for any conversations. Our system is going to auto-disconnect in about 7 minutes, but it'll auto-reconnect 15 minutes after that. That shouldn't affect anybody, but home viewers see the system flicker for a bit. That's what's going on. But in 53 minutes, we'll be back live. So I do want to thank Murray, since you're signing off for tonight. Margaret will thank you again a little bit later on, but thank you, Murray, for a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it. So we'll see you at the top of the hour.